And I give the call to the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the interim report from the Joint Standing Committee report on electoral matters into the 2022 federal election. I would note that such reports and investigations have occurred after every federal election, and it has been rare that recommendations in such reports have been implemented. So it will be interesting to see, with the change of government in this term, just which of the recommendations get picked up. I welcome the increase in transparency around donations recommended in this report, in particular the reduction in the disclosure threshold and the introduction of real-time disclosure of donations. There is no doubt that these recommendations will improve the transparency of the funding behind elections and have strong support within the community who want to know who is funding political campaigns. However, I do have concerns about the potential impact of some of the broader campaign finance reforms that have been touted, in particular around campaign caps and donation caps, because unless these are unilaterally imposed and they're done carefully, they really are ultimately embedding and entrenching incumbents' advantage and major parties' advantage. So some of these in the report recommendations will be counterproductive from a democratic point of view of broadening choice for elections for communities, because we know there is an ability from the major parties to collude around these types of reforms to make it more difficult for independent and non-aligned members to mount successful campaign challenges. I was here in the last parliament when I saw that both the Coalition and Labor colluded to change legislation around donations, for example, and around transparency, and to, again, create an advantage from and embed the status quo of the major parties in the duopoly. So I support the additional comments made by fellow crossbencher, the member for Curtin, in relation to the need to ensure that reforms do not amplify incumbent and major party advantage. Of course, it means government will need to come to these reforms with clean hands and a real good faith and genuine desire to improve democracy and not just embed their own advantage. I support the need for review of probity requirements and a consideration of enhancement of the scope of prohibited donations. The Australian public are absolutely outraged at the impact of big money, especially vested interest money, when it comes to Australian politics. Benefactors of significant government spending should be prohibited from making donations, such as the Big Four consultancies, PwC, EY, KPMG and Deloitte. We only have to look at the scandals and the allegations of the last month in relation to that, I would say, incredibly wrong relationship between some of those consultancies and government contracts for huge amounts of money, and then this vicious pool of influence that is then reinforced with donations. I note with pleasure that we in fact have a National Anti-Corruption Commission that will be commencing shortly, mostly in part from the push and the work of independent members and crossbench members to really push the major parties on such measures. And these are the areas that must be looked at, that really vexatious link between interest and influence. So there is always a risk that donations will influence policy, where the source of donations is at odds with broader community values. The barrier to donations and influence needs to be strong. The influence of industries responsible for significant social harm needs to be restricted. So tobacco, liquor, gambling industries, minerals councils, mining, significant social harm for profit, and areas that benefit from huge amounts of public spending. New South Wales, for example, already prohibits donations from these industries. New South Wales prohibits from tobacco, liquor and gambling industries. So we should be looking that at a federal level there should be some restrictions. But in fact, we saw in the last parliament major parties collude to make it easier to circumvent federal rules to have benefit of state rules when it came to Queensland. Queensland. Large corporations and registered unions should also be prohibited without member approval from making donations to political parties, because again, there is an influence and there is a benefit for access that is gained. We still do not have, in a timely way, access to ministers' diaries, for example, or the Prime Minister's diary for that matter, which has been under subject of freedom of information attempts. Now, the Australian people are entitled to know what link there is between donations, influence, whether it be from private sector or unions, to decision-making and ministers who are making decisions when it comes to large spending. Large corporations and registered unions should be prohibited without member approval. And member approval, I should say, that requirement should be developed similar to those in places in the United Kingdom. Now, I do welcome in this report the focus and the progress made in relation to misleading and deceptive political advertising. I must say, when I came into politics in 2019, it was a shock to discover that whilst we have protections for consumers when it comes to misleading and deceptive advertising, when it comes to goods and services, no protections when it comes to citizens exercising the most important right they have during elections. So the report recommends that the Australian government develop legislation or seek to amend the Commonwealth Electoral Act to provide for the introduction of measures to govern truth in political advertising and given consideration to the provisions of the South Australian Electoral Act 1985. I'd like to remind the government that already on the notice paper, the work has been done to amend the Commonwealth Electoral Act, and I have proposed a private member's bill which is still on the notice paper, the Commonwealth Electoral Act Amendment Stop the Lies Bill 2022. The bill is heavily informed by the South Australian Electoral Act. I have consulted widely with eminent experts across academic and think tank community. It's seen as a responsible and proportionate response to the threat of misinformation and disinformation that is increasingly pervading elections in Australia. It was also attempted to cover referendum advertising, but sadly the government voted with the coalition against debating the bill prior to the referendum advertising kicking in. Almost 3/4 of Australians come across false political advertisements during the 2022 federal election. Australians were relentlessly targeted with SMS advertising making all sorts of wild claims. A sceptic might claim that lies have always and will always be part of politics, but research shows that the sheer quantity of false political advertising is growing. 9 in 10 Australians want truth in political advertising laws legislated before the next federal election, according to the nationally representative polling from the Australian Institute. And importantly, the bill that I have proposed also seeks to capture disinformation and misinformation spread in referendum campaigns. In his review of every Australian referendum, Scott Bennett concluded that a great deal of exaggeration and distortion is standard fare. Already, baseless claims that the Voice would constitute a third chamber have polluted the public debate. And so for this reason, Professor Gabrielle Appleby and Lisa Hill recently recommended enacting truth in political advertising to protect the legitimacy of the referendum. So adopting the bill that is already on the notice paper could, I respectfully suggest, quickly ensure a more respectful and honest debate in the upcoming referendum. But recommendation 12 of the report recommends the government establish a division with the Australian Electoral Commission to administer legislation. I think that is a sensible recommendation. In my bill that I've proposed, the Australian Electoral Commission is responsible for the receipt and initial assessment of complaints with the ultimate recourse to the courts. This approach is consistent with the South Australian approach. The key concerns raised are resourcing the electoral commissioners, and that can certainly be taken care of it, and recommendation 12 addresses it. Similarly, restriction of the bill to matters pertaining to statements of fact will restrict the abilities of parties to prosecute concerns around political bias. Remembering that legal remedy to address misinformation and disinformation must not violate the implied freedom of political communication guaranteed under the Australian Constitution. Freedom of political speech and expression is the lifeblood of a thriving democracy. But that does not give a carte blanche to provide misleading and deceptive facts. There is a vast difference between opinion and fact, and that is fact. Misleading facts is what must be legislated and protect the Australian people as soon as possible.
And I thank the member for